Hi everyone, welcome once again to SJ's classes. I hope all of you are doing good and that you are safe and also that you are using all the precautions against the global pandemic that is spreading in our country as well as in the world. This is your fourth session. In the earlier three sessions, I spoke about Plato, his contributions to literary criticism. In the second session, I gave you an introduction to Aristotle and his poetics. In the third session, I spoke about the various counter arguments that Aristotle raised against the attacks that Plato made against poetry as well as poem. In this particular session, we will be focusing on Aristotle's contribution towards literary criticism, especially the major points that he made in his work Poetics. He'll be focusing upon this particular work Poetics. Without much further ado, let's move into the presentation. Now, you might not be familiar with this particular name of Aristotle. He is called the Stagirite because Stagira is the place where Aristotle was born. Now, he was called a peripatetic philosopher because he taught his scholars, his disciples, while they accompanied him during his walk. That is why most of his works have been retained in the form of lecture notes. Now, he established the great institution Lyceum in 335 BCE. You know his master Plato. He established the academy. And Plato's disciple Aristotle establishes this miniature form of academy which Plato built, and he named it the Lyceum, which was a gymnasium sacred to Apollo, and he directed it for 13 years. The academy was devoted to all available forms of knowledge like mathematics, speculative science, political philosophy, biological sciences, and the arts. Now, on a modest estimate, his writings run to 400 volumes. Just imagine the amount of works that he has contributed towards arts and all other fields. I hope you remember my introduction to Aristotle. It's not just arts that he focused upon. He focused upon many other disciplines. He spent some 20 invaluable years under the tutelage of Plato before establishing his own academy, and that shows how much he waited to begin something on his own. He is also popular as the tutor of Alexander the Great, who almost conquered northwestern India way back in 326 BC. A little bit of history coming in there. Aristotle addresses many problems that Plato addressed, but in many cases he shows his radical departure from Plato, whose name is not even mentioned in his famous treatise Poetics, the most valuable document in the history of Western criticism. Interpreters of Aristotle used the term achromatic with reference to his works, by which he is meant that each of his work cannot be completely understood without the aid of his other works. Something like what structuralists argue. One thing is connected to another, and if you take out that particular thing and isolate it, you won't be able to understand it profoundly. Now, the two most famous works of Aristotle, Rhetoric and Poetics. They contain the literary criticism of Aristotle, and both works are his lecture notes. Unfortunately, we are not in possession of the original text of Poetics, but there are a few manuscripts belonging to different centuries which are available in translations. Now, I don't know if you have heard about this, but there is a 11th century translation that is perhaps the earliest and the most important. This is the primary source for all later translations. There is a 10th century Arabic translation and a few other 13th and 14th century translations of this Greek manuscript. Now, though there are differences of opinion with regard to some passages, we are not up against textual difficulties in our understanding of the basic concepts of Aristotle. There are some inescapable stylistic difficulties owing to the rather terse rendering of the text. The most plausible reason, of course, is that the works are only lecture notes, which were gathered together by his students, his disciples, and not a consciously developed full-fledged treatise. So at times you will face inconsistencies when you read or when you come across poetics, and that's especially because the form that in which it exists now is or was developed from the lecture notes that his disciples took during those times. And perhaps no other work of literary criticism or theory has exerted as strong as impact as this short and incomplete treatise. Now, there are four important concepts that Aristotle speaks of in poetics. They are mimesis, catharsis, Hamartia, and spodeos. Now let us look at each one of these concepts in detail. Let's first of all look at his concept of mimesis, the idea with which Aristotle begins his criticism. Now, he did not get this idea from some book or something. He got this from his master, Plato. What we need to understand is that there are differences how Plato saw the concept of mimesis and Aristotle saw it. The most commonly accepted English equivalent of this Greek term is imitation. The concept of imitation is central to Aristotelian logic, even as it is to the Platonic, but with an essential difference. The Platonic view is that the world is an imperfect reflection of an ideal archetypal order. I hope you remember my previous class on Aristotle's response to his master's criticism, and I had explained every single counter argument that Aristotle made against his master. So Plato believed that the world is an imperfect reflection of an ideal world order. So as far as Plato is concerned, our world is already displaced once from reality. The world is a lower order of reality, and poetry, being an imitation of an imitation, is therefore thrice removed from reality. Hence, Plato banished poets from his ideal commonwealth. Now let's come to Aristotle and see how he views this concept of mimesis. Aristotle rejects Plato's doctrine of ideas. For Plato, imitation implies copying, and that is where Aristotle differs from his master. For Plato, imitation implies copying and hence trivial and insignificant. But for Aristotle, it is creative and dynamic. And this is where their points of view changes. The artist is the maker. According to Aristotle, the artist is the maker, and his creations are imitations of human action, human character, and human emotions. It is a representation and not just copying. It is not representation and not just copying or a representation of men as they are. It's different. The artist imitates things as they ought to be. So an idealized situation is what is brought about by poets and poetry. Now let's come to the second concept that has been explored in detail in your textbook. Catharsis, possibly the most famous of all the contributions made by Aristotle. This is a key word in Aristotle, occurring only twice in Poetics. It occurs in chapter 6, in which tragedy is defined. It's important that you by heart, understand, and learn the significance of this particular definition of tragedy that Aristotle proposed. He defines tragedy as an imitation of an action that is serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude, in language embellished with each kind of artistic ornament, the several kinds being found in separate parts of the play in the form of action, not of narrative, through pity and fear, the proper purgation. That is where this particular concept pops up. Purgation, catharsis, and proper purgation of these emotions of pity and fear. Now, Aristotle's theory of catharsis may be considered to be his reply to Plato's charge against tragedy that it devitalizes our emotions. The twin emotions of pity and fear, or you can call it terror, are dangerous and unhealthy according to Plato. Pity is aroused. Let's see how pity is aroused in the spectators, obviously. Pity is aroused by the magnitude of the suffering undergone by the protagonist. And how is terror evoked or fear evoked? And fear by the knowledge that tragic suffering and fate overtake one similar to us. This is the awareness that is brought home to us when we witness a tragedy. Pity and fear describe a process of moral and imaginative identification with the agent. Now, as spectators, you identify yourself with the protagonist on the stage. When we come out of this involvement with the plot, involvement with the character, his fate, his tragedy, we find ourselves inwardly transformed and feels a sense of release and serenity. Catharsis describes this process or experience. Now, catharsis, as I said earlier, means purgation of emotions, namely the emotions of fear and pity. Pity and fear are the emotions which are aroused when watching a play, especially a tragedy, both of which are detrimental to the individual. Now, that is what Plato argued. Therefore, now let's look at Aristotle's notion. Therefore, they should be purged out of the human mind with the help of a play. Pity is aroused in the individual on seeing the tragic fate of the noble hero. The plight of the hero induces fear in the audience, as the same can happen to any of them. So that is how they become involved in the play, as I said earlier. The audience identifies themselves with the hero. So whatever that happens to the hero, the audience will fear that will happen to them if they follow the same trajectory. So the audience goes through the emotions related to the suffering without actually suffering. This helps them to find peace. Now, catharsis has four aspects: the therapeutic, the moral, the structural, and the intellectual. Let's see in detail each one of them. The therapeutic. It's like homeopathic treatment where an agent similar to the disease is used to cure the disease. Similarly, fear and pity are aroused to purge them. You arouse it to purge them or to purify them. Coming to the second aspect, moral. The mind is purified of negative emotions by removing the excess. The character retains his composure and courage even when he is suffering. He is physically defeated, but spiritually he remains unconquered. This is reaffirming for the audience. Now, coming to the third aspect, which is structural, the protagonist is freed from the guilt of tragic flow by the purgation of the emotions that the audience go through. And finally, coming to the intellectual, catharsis leads to the intellectual growth of the audience. This process of learning gives pleasure to the audience. That is how the intellectual aspect is seen. And this intellectual aspect has again four aspects. It is pleasurable and not painful as in real life, because you are seeing it on the stage. You are not experiencing it in your real life. The pleasure is similar to the pleasure in learning. The learning is in the discovery of the connection between the particular incidents of the plot and the universal aspects that provide meaning to the particular events. So you see it on an individual level as well as on an universal level. And finally, the fourth aspect of the intellectual aspect is that the experience leads to a deepening of awareness. The third concept that your textbook explores is Hamartia. This term is usually rendered into English as tragic flow, FLAW, flow. It derives the meaning etymologically from archery. It means to miss the mark, to err, to fail. Hamartia in tragedy is a personal error in a protagonist's personality which brings out his tragic downfall in a tragedy. This defect in a hero's personality is also known as a tragic flaw. Aristotle used the word in his Poetics, where it is taken as a mistake or error in judgment. The term envelops wrongdoings which may be accidental or deliberate. A typical example of hamartia in tragedies is hubris. Hubris means excessive pride and ego in a hero's character. This often ultimately brings about his tragic downfall. You have such popular examples in Greek tragedies as well as English tragedies. In Greek tragedies, the hubristic actions of a hero in a powerful position cause his shame and humiliation, the most famous example being Oedipus. Oedipus, a famous Greek tragedy, is a perfect example of hamartia, in which the primary character's downfall is caused by unintentional wrongdoings. Now, if you have any knowledge of the plot of Oedipus, you will definitely understand why I quoted Oedipus as an example over here. His hubris, Oedipus' hubris, leads him to defy the prophecy of gods, but he ends up doing what he feared the most. Let's also have an example from Shakespeare, the most famous tragedian that we have seen. His Prince Hamlet's tragic flaw in Shakespeare's play Hamlet determines his tragic downfall. Hamlet's hamartia is his indecisiveness, his inability to come to conclusions, to decisions. He also used the term procrastination to signify how he deliberately delays his actions. Hamlet's hamartia is his indecisiveness. He cannot make up his mind about the dilemma he confronts. Now, coming to the next concept, it's spodeos or noble character. And for Aristotle, character is what determines moral choice. Tragedy imitates noble character and comedy base character. For the audience to feel pity, the hero should possess noble character. That is what Aristotle said. It is one of the requirements of a tragedy according to Aristotle. The protagonist, the person with hamartia, the person with a tragic flaw, the person who is to confront a tragedy must belong to must have a noble character. Aristotle defines tragedy and comedy based on the heroes. Comedy has a base character as hero, whereas tragedy has a noble character. However, Aristotelian concept of nobility is not socially determined. It is something you must note. Aristotle demands moral nobility rather than nobility of birth in the heroes of tragedies. So it's not necessary that the protagonist must belong to the noble class or the aristocratic section of the society. And he must be morally sound. He must be morally noble. Tragedies become successful when the death of their heroes has a profound effect on the society in which the hero lives. The connection between spodeos and catharsis is that only if the hero is noble will the audience experience catharsis. Look at the relationship being explored there. Similarly, Hamartia is necessary for the tragedy to occur. Let us move into the last part of Aristotle's contributions towards literary criticism from the point of view of your textbook. And in the last part, we are going to discuss elements of a tragedy. Aristotle argues that among the 6 formative elements, the plot is the most important element. Now, I hope you are familiar with the 6 elements of tragedy according to Aristotle. They are plot, character, thought, diction, music, and spectacle. And among all these, Aristotle saw plot as the most significant, most important element. The plot is the underlying principle of tragedy. By plot, Aristotle means the arrangement of incidents. He does not mean the story as such, but the arrangement of incidents, events. Incidents mean action, and tragedy is an imitation of actions, both internal and external. That is to say that it also imitates the mental processes of the dramatic person, the protagonist. The plot contains a beginning, middle, and an end. Aristotle goes on to describe the elements of plot, which include completeness, magnitude, unity, determinate structure, and universality. Now, all these aspects have connection with the plot. Now, completeness refers to the necessity of a tragedy to have a beginning, middle, and end. A beginning is defined as an origin by which something naturally comes to be. An end, meanwhile, follows another incident by necessity but has nothing necessarily following it. The middle follows something just as something must follow it. Let's come to magnitude. Magnitude refers simply to length, the length of the play. The tragedy must be of a length which can be easily embraced by the memory. That is what Aristotle said. It must be of a length which can be easily embraced by the memory. That said, Aristotle believes that the longer a tragedy, the more beautiful it can be, provided it maintains its beginning, middle, and an end. If it has a beautiful beginning, middle, and end, it doesn't matter if it stretches beyond or it stretches a bit more. And in the sequence of these 3 acts, the tragedy will present a change from bad fortune to good fortune, or from good fortune to bad. He also spoke about unity. Unity refers to the centering of the plot's action around a common theme or idea. Let's see what determinate structure means. Determinate structure refers to the fact that the plot hinges on a sequence of causal, imitative events. So if one were to remove even one part of the plot, the entire tragedy will be disjointed and disturbed. So every part is significant. Now let me also remind you that Aristotle spoke about the unity of action, that there should be a major plot. There can be subplots, but there should definitely be a major plot. So he spoke more about unity of action, and the unity of time and place were later on added on to whatever that he made earlier. Now regarding the determinate structure, to put it simply, every part of a good plot is necessary. You cannot call any part as something which is unnecessary, as less significant. That is what we mean when we say that a plot must have a determinate structure. Universality refers to the necessity of a given character to speak or act according to how all or most humans would react in a given situation, which means that you are trying to make it applicable to everyone who confronts this particular tragedy. Now, this must be done according to the law of probability or necessity. Now, according to Aristotle, tragic plots may be of 2 kinds, simple and complex. A simple plot is without any peripeteia or anagnorisis, but the action moves forward uniformly without any violent or sudden change. Now, contrasting to this, A complex plot will have peripetia and anagnorisis. What is peripetia and anagnorisis? Peripetia means a reversal of fortune, a reversal of intention, and anagnorisis means recognition of truth. Now, while peripetia is ignorance of truth, anagnorisis is the insight of truth forced upon the hero by some signs or chance or by the logic events. In ideal plot, anagnorisis follows or coincides with peripetia. Now coming to the other five aspects or elements, formative elements of tragedy, the character serve to advance the action of the story, not vice versa. It's not for the characters that the plot is made. The plot gives us characters. The ends we pursue in life, our happiness and our misery, all take the form of action. Tragedy is written not merely to imitate man, but to imitate man in action. So it's action that is focused upon. That is, according to Aristotle, happiness consists in a certain kind of activity rather than in a certain quality of character. Diction and thought are also less significant than plot. So as far as Aristotle is concerned, plot is what enjoys the superior position. Plot, a series of in case of diction and thought, a series of well-written speeches has nothing like the force of a well-structured tragedy. Lastly, Aristotle notes that forming a solid plot is far more difficult than creating good characters or diction. Having asserted that the plot is the most important of the 6 parts of tragedy, he ranks the remainder as follows from most important to least. For him, plot comes first, then character, then thought, diction, melody, and finally comes spectacle. The properties that you use. Stage setting. Character reveals the individual motivations of the characters in the play, what they want or don't want, and how they react to certain situations. And this is more important to Aristotle than thought, which deals on a more universal level with reasoning and general truths. Diction, melody, songs, and spectacle are all pleasurable accessories, but melody is more important in tragedy than spectacle. So you see a hierarchical arrangement being made there by Aristotle, but after all, for him, plot is what concerns him the most, and that is why he calls it as the soul of tragedy or the principal element of tragedy. With that, we come to the end of this session. Thank you so much for watching. In the next session, I will speak about 2 Roman critics, Horace and Longinus. See you in the next session. Thank you.